and I give the floor to Dr. Trefero for the first two presentations this morning. As always, we have long breaks, so we're not rushed.
Right. So first, I want to welcome our speakers to Montreal and to this workshop. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me as one of the chairs for the sessions. And maybe just make a comment on the importance of the topic with respect to someone who's actually participating in contemporary clinical medicine and at the same time trying to introduce and bring to market or to practice some innovative contemporary methodology. So to me, this is sort of a very pertinent discussion, and it's a pertinent discussion, obviously, to the field of clinical medicine. So let me introduce our first speaker this morning, Dr. Heiner Fangerau. It's actually, he was giving me a little history about his family name, and actually it's a French name, so it's a lot easier to present Fangerau than what the German version of it. So it's nice to have him here. I think he's a perfect person to give us his insight and interpretation. He is from the Department of History, Philosophy, and Ethics of Medicine at Heinrich Heine University in Duesseldorf. So he has a peculiar interest in this field, and I think we'll lend very, very much so to the general discussion of the crossroads between contemporary medical advancements and what it means to medicine as a whole. So his title is very interesting as well. So, Technicalisation of Medicine, Users as Agents of Innovation in the Age of Medicalization. So, welcome, Dr. Fangerau, and I'll leave it up to you to start the presentation.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Thanks, Thomas and Lawrence, for having me and for the invitation, and thanks to Barbara for taking care of my being here safe and in time. Thank you. Yes, well, I tried to address the topic of the conference of centers and margins, and after the discussions yesterday, I changed tiny little bits of the talk, but it is still a prominent issue here. And the metaphor of centers and margins, let me start with that, as a framework for analyzing the context of technological change in medicine has, as we have heard yesterday, many implications and meanings. On the level of questioning technological evolution, another difficult word, it can be both explainance and explanandum. And on the level of mapping change in technology, it serves as a spatial metaphor, referring to either locations, actors, or even ideas. And having these modes of understanding centers and margins in mind, the image of a space occurs in mind, in which various items are connected that via their linkage might help to explain opportunities and obstacles for technological innovation in medicine. A German historian of economy, Helmut Braun, for example, could show for the innovation and market placement of the extracorporeal shockwave lithotripsy how a socio-economic network of engineers, physicians, economists, politics, meaning regulatory authorities, health insurances, hospital managers, and patients' representatives together joined forces in establishing this new technology as the cutting-edge technology of getting rid of kidney and urine stones. Such networks of opportunity are multimodal. They not only include people, but also abstractions from people activities like institutions, technologies, or slippery concepts like ideas. Networks are, as the work as the word work in the network implies, by definition, unstable and constantly changing, and changes in the centrality of certain nodes over time are often interpreted as representing something like general social developments. It's a hen and egg problem, whether changes in centers and margins represent social trends or whether social trends are the driving forces behind these changes. In reverse, as just said, once defined social trends are often used as historically contingent structural invariants that determine technological change in a certain time. For the 20th century, sociologists and historians have described medicalization, individualization, and technicization, meaning mechanization, as key processes in the understanding of medical transformations. Medicalization, in this sense, is usually understood as, I quote Peter Conrad here, a process by which non-medical problems become defined and treated as medical problems. Technicization, at the same time, refers to the process of a growing mechanization of human work and cultural life. Individualization, finally, describes a growing focus of individuals on their own lives, including acts of privatization, personal risk assessment, subjectivity, and self-governance. Risks are not communalized, communitarian anymore, but risks are personal risks. This is what individualization means in a way. In my presentation, I will argue that in the 21st century, these three trends have merged into an intricate conglomerate of dealing with health in the digital era, characterized also by the dissolution of central and peripheral actors in classical innovation networks. Using the example of blood pressure measurement as a diagnostic technique and diabetes monitoring as an interwoven diagnostic-therapeutic technique, I will try to show how traditional triangles of physicians, engineers, and economists in these networks of inventors and promoters of medical innovations expanded into innovation networks which involve further actors from politics, pharmaceutical industries, or other social groups. Additionally, users themselves increasingly act as agents of innovation, not only anymore as consumers or modifiers of existing technologies, but rather as inventors and do-it-yourself communities. The examples of blood pressure and diabetes have also been used by other authors, focusing mainly on medicalization so far, and risk assessment names include Peter Conrad, Oliver Falk, or Carsten Timmermann, just for those who are familiar with our small community of medical historians and other historians. Yeah. And let me start with a case study of blood pressure measurement. According to the WHO, cardiovascular diseases belong to the main causes of death. As a consequence, they have become a crucial object of research and health politics. At the same time, this field of cardiovascular diseases offers a huge market for the pharmaceutical industry and medical technology. According to Peter Conrad, elevated blood pressure, I quote, was first medicalized on the conceptual level as hypertension, then on the organized level through blood pressure screenings, and finally by physicians in their diagnosis of hypertension as a risk factor for illness and prescribing pharmaceutical treatment. I will follow this narrative of a conceptual level, an organizational, structural level, and the level of doing. You will notice that throughout the two examples. One of the main points of reference for blood pressure is the famous Framingham study, a longitudinal cohort study which allowed to identify high blood pressure, hypertension, as a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Although, I have the same problem as you had yesterday, but yeah. maybe it works. You should see here a promotion slide from Singapore for it says high blood pressure kills. This. Just believe me. I don't want to change the computer. So it's rather an illustration of what I'm saying. So, yeah. Although poverty or living conditions could be correlated to hypertension, prevention politics did not focus so much on addressing society as a whole. It's too complicated, too expensive, too blurred. Rather, medicine and medical politics focused on parameters like blood pressure levels or cholesterol blood levels as the target points for intervention. These target points could be addressed more directly, and they offered a chance for the development of marketable products for diagnostic and therapies. The main actors were institutions like the American Heart Association or the National Heart Institute in the USA, or similar organizations all over the Western world. In Germany, for example, the Germans have a special addiction to heart and heart diseases. In Europe, you have the joke that the French concentrate on liver and the Germans on the heart, on heart diseases. It's a special focus. Well, in Germany, for example, the Expert Council for the Evaluation of Public Health Developments, this Expert Council really exists, Sachverständigenrat zur Begutachtung der Entwicklung im Gesundheitswesen, diagnosed in 2002 an underrepresentation of preventive measures to lower risk factors for hypertension. And similar statements can be found from representatives of German health insurances. Thus, conceptually, the former risk factor for cardiovascular disease has become a disease entity itself, high blood pressure kills, for which further individual risk factors existed. There's a slight shift in the understanding. Also, the threshold of the normal and the pathological was regularly adjusted since the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, people believed high blood pressure to be a good sign because it meant a strong heart. This is the starting point. And from that day on, high blood pressure became more and more a disease. For a very long time, when I studied, for example, a level of 140 to 90 millimeters of, do you say mercury column? HG. Mercury column was considered preferable. It's also interesting that in modern times you still use the old traditional mercury scale. Meanwhile, the German Hypertonus League recommends values lower than 135 to 85, and the WHO published a classification of arterial hypertension in 1999, which has now been adjusted by the American Heart Association in 2017. And what you can see here is that the American Heart Association, always the lower, the lower line, consistently published in these guidelines values that are 10 millimeters lower with an entity, and they introduced an entity called pre-hypertension, being in the range of the former WHO's normal blood pressure. So pre-hypertension is the new disease. This steady decrease of thresholds, I could expand the example, but I think this illustrates it quite well. For what is perceived as normal has not been left without criticism, of course, by some contemporary observers. They said that the idea of thresholds had made redundant the concept of health and normal physiology, healthy and normal physiology. The low values would result in 90% of the population suffering from pathology, meaning in this case a high risk for cardiovascular disease. And final criticism, ideal values could not be reached, which results in an increasing number of measurements and close meshed controls. The number of measurements increases because you never reach the value you want to reach. The psychological fixation on the threshold level and the high number of futile controls would finally create a vicious circles of measurement and surveillance. At this point, technology and economy come into play. In the course of this shift in blood pressure's conceptualization, the offer of risk control options experienced a remarkable increase. These options did not only focus pharmaceuticals, but explicitly included medical technology. Technical measurement devices are the key to understand the concept of blood pressure. And from its inception, the idea of hypertension was linked to technical measurement. Again, I brought an old tonometer produced by Recklinghausen in 1906, which already was designed to be carried around by a physician. Here you see the rest of the arm of the physician. The picture is broken again.
Wenn du auf den Nicht-Repräsentationsmodus gehst, kann man das sozusagen vielleicht so sehen.
Yeah, good idea. No,
Oh, you can't. Oh.
I can't.
No.
Well, there's no point in.
It's an old version of
Yeah.
PowerPoint.
No, there's no. Well, how do I get back to it? Oh dear.
Now go back.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's no point in adjusting it right now. So I
Can borrow my laptop? If you
no,
want?
I have one, but the whole process would take too much. It's just an illustration. What I want to show is that from the beginning on, the tools were designed not only to stand in a practice, but that doctors could carry them around. And measurement became a crucial element. In the year 2012, in Germany, the turnover of measurement devices for self-measurement at home, finally, not at the practice, but at home, reached 42 million euros. And this technological factory praises itself with 100 million blood pressure monitors units sold. And for the pharmaceutical industry, blood pressure medication is one of the most profitable businesses so far. Consequently, producers of medical products and hypertension medication are heavily involved in the propagation of continuous measuring and intervention in cases of hypertension. They sponsor guidelines, congresses, and public health campaigns. At the same time, they foster the individualization and privatization of blood pressure measuring by producing digital mobile electronic devices for home use. Not anymore the doctor in the practice, the physician is doing measurement, but people should do it at home. The German Hochdruckliga, a German league, same problem. It's from one of their brochures. For their part, they certify devices and at the same time promote monitoring and recording blood pressure pressure measurement at home, and they give buy recommendations. These are 3 pages. I tell you what you should see. 3 pages from one of their publications. The first is hypertension in children as one of the articles. It's about hypertension in children. The next page is a full page with an advertisement for a self-measurement product, and the page 18 shows 8 devices that have a stamp of being good and healthy. So it's intertwined. The network of the different actors involved is displayed here quite openly. Nothing is hidden. Their interests are embodied in a technology having become a normative artifact based on the cultural practice of quantifying and classifying. Self-control and self-measurement is the motto of the times. The demand for a blood pressure device for everyone, this is one slogan, seems to promise a great market, and on a political level, self-measurement is propagated. The World Hypertension League declared already in the year 1988 that this year should be the year of blood pressure self-measurement. Like the year of the tiger in China, it's the year of blood pressure measurement. Or a report on health published by the German government in 2008 stated, I quote, "Further advantagement of self-measurement are the possibility of controlling therapies costs effectively or the inclusion and empowerment of the patient in managing his or her disease." As a consequence, physicians and apothecaries are asked to inform people about self-measurement. This development started, as this quote from the WHO shows, in the late 1980s. And for a long time before, occasional measurements were the rule. Patients seemed already to, although patients seemed to have demanded occasional measurements in a physician's practice quite early, meaning that the medical indication might have been questionable right from the start, because people are not measured due to an indication, but because they wanted it. One of the entrepreneurs of blood pressure measurement, Samuel von Basch, noted indignantly, surprised in 1896, after 15 years of practicing the measurement in his own practice, that his patient considered measuring as an integral part of their medical consultation and that they explicitly asked for it. In an account of his practice, Basch described the situation that people consulted him, and I quote, "Right away, they put their arm on my table in the position well known to them without waiting for my command to do so." So the practice of measuring has existed, but it has expanded since the 1990s at the latest. A vast number of apparatuses have been developed. I think this doesn't work either. No, yeah, has been developed. Yeah, and if you go to the internet, you will find thousands of them. An interesting feature in this development is that after physicians had sought to have control over the measurement practice over many years, the function of control and surveillance was individualized and transferred to the patients themselves. At first, these occasional measurements by the doctors, as I said, were the standard. However, these proved to be error-prone, the white coat effect and things like that. So the result was a propagation at first of 24-hour measurement, continuous 24-hour measurement. Still, the doctors had control. Yet, the patients, I looked through blogs and patient reports, never really accepted the practice of 24-hour measurement with a cuff around an arm, which regularly inflated and measured a whole day long. They disliked the foreign touch, the regular sounds, the machine-like bzzz, and many expressed uneasiness with their impression of feeling like a man-machine during these 24 hours. This becomes important in a minute. In this situation, self-measurement with an increasing number of measurement points appeared as a one-fits-all solution, which became then the new standard. Nevertheless, physicians kept on bemoaning that patients measured incorrectly because they were either using the devices in the wrong way or because they fabricated results in order to please their doctors or their relatives. So hypertension endpoints were marginalized during these processes. As a consequence and as a compromise, the Second International Consensus Conference on Self-Measurement, it really existed, recommended to prioritize devices with automatic data recording over the self-documentation by the patient. And this way control comes back. It's been handed over to the patient, but it is taken back for them by automatic documentation. Especially connecting measurement, automatic data recording, and telemedicine seems to be the dernier cri. Is it possible to say dernier cri in English? Yeah, the latest trend. Yeah, recorded data, like this picture illustrates, are sent via Bluetooth to a mobile phone, which sends an SMS to a central database where the data is monitored. Here, patient and doctor in the end can see the data via internet and the development. Patients cannot anymore polish their data, and an automatic alarm goes off as certain thresholds are met. Now the patient is not anymore the recorder, but his or her body is directly linked to a database, which is a further step in the incorporation of measurement systems into the patient's bodies. The final step now is intravasal monitoring systems for hypertensions, which are currently being researched in order to come to a quasi-continuous control, monitoring and surveillance of blood pressure, pulse and body temperature. Not any more measurement points, but continuous measurement. And in the body, this is the plan. The whole process is justified with the physician's need to have correct data at hand to plan possible preventions of therapeutic measures. Control and surveillance via technology serve the interest of promoting health. This is the justification. The arguments to further pursue this approach are preventive on the one hand, but they are also economic on the other. The number of visits to the physician shall be decreased, health costs shall be saved, and costs for buying the respective devices shall be privatized, since the prevention of health risk is a private issue, different from the treatment of a disease. Prevention is private, so the costs for buying the whole thing should be privatized. The patients, again, shall still have the impressions of being actively involved because they determine the measuring process and the devices belong to them. It's my device. It doesn't belong to a hospital. It's my device. In that way, all the actors mentioned above hope to gain benefits from the miniaturization and multiplication of blood pressure measurements. However, the whole process has consequences for the user's body image and body governmentality. Because the spectrum of sensible manifestation of hypertension is limited, this was hard to translate what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say is you can't feel blood pressure. It's not a sensation like pain. And the promoters of blood pressure measurement seek to extend the measurement as far as possible for the sake of health. You can only feel the ends, hypo and hypertension, but nothing in between. And the answer is increase the measurement points. At the same time, the users experience the development of two body realities. Next to the subjective, sensible body reality, the technical devices create an objective, technical body reality comparable to a new dimension of reality. It might be compared to the senses of, we do not know, but we know other animals have, like the ultrasound of the bats. It's a sense that exists and we don't have it. And this new body reality of incorporated permanent measurement is such a new sense. The closer the devices get to the body, the more these two realities are merged into one. Body and technology become interlinked and in a way hybridized, which gives the old image of the cyborg, of the 24-hour measurement, as a biological technological hybridization, a much more friendly face. Technology has become human. This brings me to the second example of blood sugar monitoring and diabetes therapy. I will keep it a little bit briefer. The number of people suffering from diabetes, as you know, is increasing constantly. Currently, it's said that 7 to 12% of the Western population suffers from this chronic disease. Two types of diabetes are differentiated on etiological grounds. Type 1 diabetes, 6% of all cases, occurs in childhood or in youth and is the result of an autoimmunological destruction of insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. Type 2 diabetes, 94%, is characterized by a reduced sensibility of the organism to insulin. It's more complicated, but this is the brief description. The later is, according to the current state of knowledge, the result of a combination of genetic susceptibility, wrong food, obesity, and immobility. Next to the primary disease, the consequential disorders are relevant, angiopathies resulting in further diseases. Essential for the management of the disease are adherence to therapy and a consequent surveillance of blood sugar levels in order to administer the therapy. The levels need to be monitored constantly, which is usually only possible if patients measure the levels themselves. They cannot go to the hospital whenever they want to measure their blood sugar level. Patients need support, education, and counseling by professionals to be able to do so, because hospitals and physicians do not have enough capacities to guarantee permanent support. Telemedical devices for monitoring blood sugar levels are now entering the market, including call centers like the one presented by Lawrence yesterday, of non-medics giving advice after certain levels are reached. Especially for insulin-dependent diabetics, to whom I will stick now in the following, measuring is fundamental because the amount of insulin to be substituted depends on the blood sugar level. At first, measurement techniques were developed in the 1940s. By the way, it was a Canadian who developed insulin, as you might know, Banting. Yeah. Well, he didn't invent it, but he was involved in the whole process. Yeah. Only 20 years later, 1960s, test stripes for measuring blood glucose levels were developed. And your talk yesterday reminded me of these test stripes because they are a precursor of what you presented for pregnancy tests. Again, some years later, the first measurement device entered the market. A frequency before these measurement devices for home use entered the market, a frequency of measuring blood sugar once a month was not uncommon. Once a month. Only when in 1983 a battery-driven test stripe reader called Reflux, because it's based on light, was sold for home use, patients could start controlling their glucose levels themselves at home. Since several years, the repeated daily self-measurement of blood glucose has become a standard to adjust the insulin dose. However, since at the latest 2006, diabetologists agree that spot measurements 6 times a day are really not enough. You need to measure more often. Like blood glucose levels cannot be sensed unless they are extremely high or extremely low, so they need to be measured. Thus, an intricate constant measurement and the monitoring of blood glucose profile would be the optimum to reduce the danger of too high or too low glucose levels with their deleterious consequences. With the rising of self-measurement techniques, diabetics, I know it's not politically correct to call people suffering from diabetes that way, but I will do now without any negative connotations, just to name the group in short. With the rising of self-measurement techniques, diabetics were equipped themselves with an arsenal of devices to determine their glucose levels. In addition to the measurement devices, they have needles, lancets, test stripes, control fluids, and for the application of insulin, syringes, pens, infusion sets, pumps, and pump equipment. They are, as Annemarie Mohl phrased it, their own laboratory technician and adopt the necessary skills. They have to take blood from themselves 6 or more times a day. Regarding the consequences, Annemarie Mohl stated, from my perspective correctly, using the device may shift people's attention away from their physical sensations towards the numbers measured, but it may also help them to increase their own physical self-awareness. Self-monitoring, finally, something that the devices have made possible, this is important, finally makes patients less dependent on professionals, but it requires them to engage in self-disciplining and binds them to the outcomes of their measurement activities, their own blood sugar levels. They self-discipline themselves. Not anymore a doctor tells them do more sports, eat less, but they do it themselves after they applied their whole equipment. Self-control, self-regulation, and self-governance by numbers are the key features for this medicalized, privatized, and technicized self. Cristiano Storni, a scientist who performed several ethnological and ethnographic studies among diabetes, concluded that diabetes, through this development, is so ubiquitous that it has become a kind of a lifestyle for diabetics. And I quote him, "When interacting with affected people, the fact that diabetes is so ubiquitous and ever-present that it takes the form of the lifestyles, becomes immediately evident. The effects of the disease are so intrinsically intertwined with everyday life that it is practically impossible to separate the disease from daily mundane activities and thoughts. Sports, food, and other daily behavior have a strong influence on the glucose levels and the necessary intake of insulin. And just in line with this observation, you can find blog entries by diabetics like this one. I translated it a little bit awkwardly, but I tried to keep the colloquial style, and my English was not good enough. But I think you get the sense. This is what a woman writes. Diabetes is here, every day, every night, every hour, minute, second. In any situation, it requires attention. Also in those when you really need it the least. As a diabetic, you do not have any other chance than thinking daily about what your beloved pancreas would do if it still worked correctly. A chocolate bar in between, what would the pancreas do? A strong walk, what would the pancreas do? Just think like a pancreas. The pancreas is indeed the crucial element in treatment. Because it cannot be regenerated, and insulin, well, yesterday I heard it can be regenerated.
It can be regenerated.
Yeah, so I skipped that. Because it's not easy to regenerate the cells, and insulin needs to be substituted, technical solutions for a simulation of the pancreas function are of greatest interest. Current research focuses on devices for continuous glucose monitoring, continuous blood pressure monitoring, continuous glucose monitoring, also to avoid the daily stitching. A sensor is put, and this continuous glucose monitoring is linked to insulin pumps. A sensor is put under the skin where it can remain for 14 days. An electronic sender is stick to the skin. The sender communicates with the monitor or recorder. Today this can be the smartphone. And the CGM system can now be combined directly with an insulin pump in order to regulate the insulin uptake. This is the latest development. And the coupling of glucose monitoring device and insulin pump as a device results in a closed loop system serving basically as an artificial technical pancreas. And the idea is to make it as small as possible and to integrate it into the body as much as possible, that people can be like this person on the advertisement slide of Medtronics. Diabetics especially express their enthusiasm in the end for the graphic displays showing the glucose values and the visualization of trends. They love these curves if you look at the blocks. And because this helps them to avoid hyper and hypoglycemic stage by developing strategies when they know their body. Again, the new sense is here. In the German diabetic community, initiatives like CGM for everybody were established. In blogs, users advised each other how to finance this relatively expensive technology, because health insurances at first were reluctant to pay for the devices. Thus, a cheaper variant of the original, called Freestyle Libre, produced by Abbott, also known as CGM for the poor, entered the market. And the main difference between the systems is that Freestyle does not measure automatically, but the patient scans the sensor himself, and this makes the device cheaper. This is not necessarily seen as a disadvantage by the diabetics. One blogger wrote about the interaction of man and technology. In this case, I quote, "As often as I have scanned the sensor during the last days, I felt not to have measured during the last years. I am highly motivated and simply like how simple the trend can be displayed with Libre," the glucose trend. The measuring process increased attention towards my own body. Finally, campaigns of diabetics, together with evidence of the therapeutic value of the systems, resulted in June 2016 in the decision of the German Public Health Insurance to further on pay for real-time CGM devices. So the users forced the insurances to pay. Last but not least, it is this highly active community of diabetics that time and again comes forward with suggestions for innovations from their own. The field is so dynamic that classical regulations of medical project developments cannot be applied anymore correctly. Germany has developed a scheme for regulating medical products after the Americans used to say either take guinea pigs or German for testing medical devices. But these regulatory standards are too slow to meet the demands of the patients. The president of the working group Diabetes and Technology, which was established by the industry and the government in Germany, stated in an overview of diabetes technologies that the long approval procedure results in the establishment of structures that allow patients to use innovations here and now without governmental control. I quote, "Parents, for example, made it possible to monitor the blood glucose levels of their children permanently by hacking the respective software. The resulting legal consequences are seen by them as less important than the safety of the children." And here you have an interesting turning point. People do it themselves, and the government and the professions are uneasy with that because regulations are broken. And Germans love regulations. Under the hashtag "We Are Not Waiting," we find a group of parents of diabetic children who created the project Night Scout. They did not want to wait any longer for offers from the medical industries, but took themselves in innovative initiatives in developing monitoring devices and in hacking the software of the devices to adjust the software to their needs. In a self-description, the group writes, "Night Scout, CGM in the cloud, is an open source do-it-yourself project that allows real-time access to continuous glucose monitoring data via personal website, smartwatch viewers, or apps and widgets are available for smartphones." Similarly, the well-known diabetes app My Sugar was created by a digital health startup founded in 2012 in Vienna by affected people. This, however, My Sugar, has meanwhile been capitalized, sold, and incorporated into the Roche imperium. And Roche sells measurement sticks, insulin pens, and the insulin itself. So it tries to capture the innovation for themselves. So does the empire strike back? In our terms, the center, the former center of innovation, does it strike back? And this leads me to the conclusion. It is not as simple as that this empire strikes back. At first sight, the initiatives on hypertension prevention seem to represent classical centers and margins in technological change in medicine. In blood pressure, you could see that these initiatives were politically driven. Politics reacted to public health necessities in order to combat the dangers of epidemiological and demographic change. Biomedical and managed care organizations took the role of distributing knowledge, devices, and therapeutics. The industries involved participated in economic development schemes worth several millions, and nice interactions occur, like one by the Ministry for Research and Development together with an association, Verband Deutscher Ingenieure, which is mainly an association of engineers. The resulting body image is that of a body being medicalized and technicized with health risks and costs simultaneously privatized. This is at least the image of blood pressure measurement. Nevertheless, the propagation of self-measurements seems to hint at a first swing of who was central in the development. Peter Conrad, in an early attempt to describe the engines of medicalization, diagnosed a shift in the 20th century from the medical profession, interprofessional or organizational contests and social movements and interest groups to biotechnology, consumers, and managed care organizations. Yet, this traditional image, which you can see in blood pressure management, has meanwhile experienced a further modification as the diabetes case displays. Projects like Night Scout or My Sugar are examples of bottom-up innovations based on the initiative of affected persons who use methods of the do-it-yourself movement and who apply digital technologies. Their developments are often open source and distributed via social media to allow as many people as possible to participate in the development and use. This redistribution of innovative potential influences the way we see medical technology as an integral part of the human body, and it reshapes the discourses about the further evolution of medical technologies and who's central and peripheral to that. It also changes the whole architecture of centers and margins in these innovation networks, when classical centers like the big players have to adjust and react to actors and developments that pop up not like a network, but rather like branched rhizomes, like bambus. It's under the ground and suddenly it pops up. There is a network, but you can't see the network anymore. Here we see a community which actively engages in the dialectics of empowerment and freedom on the one side, and the subordination to technical measurement and control on the other side. At the same time, for this community, the process of medicalization, technicalization, and privatization have become one, so to say. Thus, in the diabetes case, I would not speak of three different sociological concepts with the help of which the phenomena of technically supported self-monitoring can be described. I would rather tend to see them as intricately combined, as interwoven entanglement which might be captured with the neologism technicalisation, taking bits and pieces of every word. That said, I would also argue that centers and margins in this process depend on the point of view. As stated above, my sugar is meanwhile sold to Roche. But still, the question is whether my sugar now is the center of Roche's further activities, or whether Roche is as a center simply reintegrated the periphery. The future will show. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, so we'll move on to a discussion. We'll start off with some questions. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks very much. So, just to select one aspect of your two examples, because it fits in with what Lawrence in his first talk yesterday brought up, the cutting out of the doctor as an intermediary. So it's also a story, both are stories of de-intermediation, but and then I would also include the yesterday's story about home pregnancy testing. So all three examples, pregnancy testing, blood pressure, diabetes, could be analyzed under this rubric of cutting out the doctor as an intermediary. But the examples are very, very different from each other, as you made a point of that in your talk, in your examples. And the example of home pregnancy testing is still very different. But they all have in common that the doctor-patient relationship, as we know it, is completely changed. So the doctor is basically absent. What the big difference in all three of them is the role of the patient, the agency of the patient. So what is the patient do? How much agency does the patient have? Or not in the case of a home pregnancy test, it's not even a patient. So it's not even the patient role that's assigned to the user. So how much we can call, I'm hesitating to use the word user even for that, because can you call the person with a permanent blood pressure measurement a user? So it's maybe the agency versus passivity that are very different in each of these cases. That's basically what struck me as. So you have the same phenomenon of de-intermediation, but actually the consequences for the patient and the role of the patient are completely different.
I think the de-intermediation progresses with the way the devices used become black boxes, but this is just an idea. The device we saw yesterday still had chemicals on the bottom, and there was a test tube. And this, you can understand what's happening, and you might need an expert to explain to you why it works, if you're interested in how it works. The pregnancy tests now are black box. They just have a window. Or the devices, the blood sugar measurement devices, you do not even see the test stripe anymore. And so the expert is not anymore needed to explain, because the thing works as a black box, and you can have people who designed the black box to tell you how they work. And the agency of the patient is a very interesting thing for me if you look at the diabetes community and at the blood pressure measurement community. The people start as patients when they have symptoms, the classical way. They go to the physician, they are diagnosed, and then the intermediation starts. As I stated above, the diabetics would call themselves, with all the devices, rather a lifestyle. And the closer these continuous glucose monitoring and insulin pumps get to being an integral part of the body, the closer they get to diabetes not being a classic. It is a classical disease. It's the problem we had yesterday over dinner. It still is a disease, of course, but the people cope with it. This is their agency, as if it is a lifestyle. And this is different from coping from other fatal diseases.
From a business school viewpoint, we've encouraged innovation from the community, the patient community. But from a medical viewpoint, there's risks that someone might die from it, have negative medical outcomes. Have you seen negative medical outcomes because of things they did themselves?
I haven't seen them, but this is the constant warning by diabetologists.
I guess is the question.
And take it differently. If you take the first part of the talk, blood pressure measurement, and what I might have insinuated here is that the blood pressure levels now proposed by the American Heart Foundations are too low. Well, I would not argue for that discussing with patients, because I fear that maybe the Heart Association is right. Yeah. So I used it rather descriptive than normative, because this is the problem with prevention. You, in the end, never really know whether somebody has the stroke because of the high blood pressure or something else.
Okay.
Thomas, I'm sorry, did you want to comment on his discussion?
I can do that later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Boris?
I just throw out two ideas. One is the notion in terms of centers and margins, that you might be able to imagine that physicians as the center and patients as the margins in the context of what you're saying. And just to take that a little bit further, just lost my thought.
Patients and physicians as centers and margins.
Yeah, but as an extension of that, I was going to throw out another idea, which just escaped me. It's the difference in interest between physicians and patients. Physicians are interested in disease. Patients are interested in wellness. And those are not absolutely aligned goals, because well patients don't need to go to doctors. And wellness is a function of lifestyle and real-time engagement with one's own body. You can't expect to have a patient-physician relationship 24 hours a day. So as we understand disease better, and as technology progresses and allows us to either predict or treat things or identify potential problems much earlier, it's almost a requirement that patients take control of their bodies and their health situation, which will necessarily be at the expense of physicians who won't downstream see these patients as patients. They may not see them at all. And at a sort of 50,000-foot level, this was the first question that Thomas and I looked at with respect to surgery versus medical therapy of certain diseases. And the best example probably is peptic ulcer disease. I mean, when I trained as a surgeon, when Dr. Sigmund trained me, we used to take out, 3, 4, 5 stomachs a week on people who had peptic ulcer disease. Today, peptic ulcer disease isn't a surgical disease. It's treated with antibiotics, and it isn't really a disease at all. If anything, it's a bacterial infection. And I think that's where a lot of things are moving, including diabetes, actually. So the definitions of how we viewed medicine and the patient-physician relationship, I think, are in active evolution.
Just a short comment on that. I fully agree with you, and I love the idea of differentiating the interests. We are not without historical models for that. I want to avoid to be too presentistic now, or are historical. But if you take the time when disease didn't matter as much as lifestyle, antiquity, medieval times, leading a healthy life was the goal, physicians still had their role in counseling people how to administer the 6 unnatural things, food and drug.
Pre-internet.
Yeah, pre-internet. and this is we have a model for these prevention politics, but at that time there were much fewer professionals, so this could mean the development could mean a shrinking of the community of physicians. And what you say, what is new now is that the knowledge that was administered in that time is now much more democratized, and so the process of counseling for these diseases has to be rethought all over again. I think it's not, final word, it's not enough to say that the internet is unreliable and the information there has been produced by some obscure people, so visit the doctor. Physicians have to invent something new for
Goes back to Asclepius and Cassidesus and the relationship between those two gods, if we call them gods.
Go ahead.
So I find it fascinating, and I think you brought it out very nicely, this co-evolution between, I guess you call technicalization, I would call digitalization, and medicalisation, right? So it makes possible, new forms of relationships, and it affects the balance of information power or the asymmetry between patients and doctors. But the examples you give are about these devices, and these devices actually share data the data is held on by or is accessible by the company that made the device. And I think Lawrence yesterday talked about them as potential value-added providers. Is that the right word? Yeah. So the isn't that the elephant in the room, that actually it's not a zero-sum game between patients and doctors, but actually both are losing something. The fact that parents have to hack into the system to get access to information, means that the company actually can grab this information, maybe in an anonymous way, but it's the equivalent of what Facebook is doing today, right?
Yeah, good thought. Well, the fact that people hack it means they want agency and have agency. At the same time, you're completely right. The data belong to the company. Even some of these, I checked some of the tools. Even if you delete your profile, it says in the data protection amendment that the data will be left there. And you're right, the data, this is an interesting point, yeah.
Yeah, because it completely follows up on that. What I wanted to ask is if you could expand a bit more on something that you have touched upon, which is informed consent. So, to what extent users agree to the way the data they are given is used, either by the company who that markets the device or any other third parties, because the data may be anonymized, but if it's shared with third parties using big data algorithms, you can infer a lot of information and even de-anonymize the person who has given the data. So it was that question, and whether even if there are informed consent plans in place for the users of those devices, how does this connect with a discussion that I know that is going on, for example, in bioethics around biobanks, which is that basically this shifting of responsibility from doctors to patients, even if there are informed consent arrangements in place, connects with a very liberal social contract in which, you say, but individuals, they are given informed consent, they can anonymize the data, they can basically be the owners of how they donate the data, etc. But obviously, I guess if they are downloadable mobile apps, etc., do people really read that? Do people really agree with that? Do people have the time to read, to consult the Data Protection Act, to see exactly how the data are going to be treated? And very much connects to Facebook. I completely agree.
As far as I see it, and read through the blog entries, the benefits are for the people using the device. It's so high that they really do not care much for the data. I tracked one blood pressure measurement monitoring device, a German web page. The data protection statement was hidden somewhere in the bottom. You had to go through 4 or 5 clicks to end up in an English page which said that all the data will be hosted in Switzerland. It becomes much more complicated, but the people use it. And the reason why is like I use my iPhone and forget to close the map app because I like the map app. I use it, although I know that my wife could track me now. but here is another interesting. This is another interesting thing. The value of transparency is put forward here. But what people forget is that transparency is not a value itself. It's a means to reach certain values. But the companies say, if you have nothing to hide, why can't we have your data? And the diabetics say, well, we have nothing to hide because it helps me. And the apps, just to finish that, are really smart. Not smart, they are funny. I only have this in German, sorry. But the second point, it says, well, here you have your synchronized blood sugar values, your CGM data, and this says your estimated HbA1c value, the long time monitor in the blood. And this is not measured, but it's estimated. So the goal for the people, like in a computer game, is not to have a nice line here, but to lower the estimated HbA1c. It is like these anonymous alcoholics, or how is it called when people want to lose weight? Weight Watchers. Yeah. Like they adopted the strategies. They promise that there's something in return for the transparency, and that's my impression why people are doing that. The concerns are raised by physicians, bioethicists, but having in mind what Sama just said, maybe these, I'm devilish now, but maybe these concerns are raised because the physicians don't want to lose the majesty over the data.
Just to follow up very quickly, I think this touches upon a general point that maybe we can discuss towards the end of the workshop, which is whether in this context of demediation that medical innovations are promoting, what is the role maybe of physicians, whether physicians should just let the responsibility to be shifted to the users and say, well, it's completely individual's choice, if they want to consent to that, is a bit their problem, etc. That would be, I think, more a classical liberal social contract in which you just trust, in the rational capacity of individuals, or whether the physicians should take a more, I don't know how to call it, and probably there are more experts than me in this room, a more Kantian approach of saying, no, I mean, there are things here, that cannot be tolerated, and we cannot, our responsibility as physicians is also to protect maybe patients, to not be, their medical data to be a bit in jeopardy because they are not really signing, the clauses are hidden, we cannot accept that medical information escapes our control, our professional control that much, and I think this is a very important ethical point.
I see another aspect of a brother with late adult onset diabetes 1 has a pump, and he's constantly, that little story about every minute of the day, part of life is there. And I think when he comes to visit, he doesn't talk about the doctor, but he's always checking, he's always watching this, and it's hard for him to balance his levels. And I think there's a fear, too, that he's now in control of himself. But what is that background fear that maybe he's not doing it right, or the doctor's not present? And he can't keep running to the doctor, obviously, every time he sees a swing or something like that. So I think the doctor is still in the background, or some other authority that will be there in case he can't control it anymore.
Yeah, it's privatized, the risks and the practice, but you're right that there's still something in the background. Yeah.
Can I just comment on that? Because there is an evolution of this argument, which is that at some point in the not too distant future, which could be next year, machine learning and artificial intelligence will be good enough, if it isn't already, to deal with those kind of situations. So that built in to one's glucose sensor or insulin pump and or both will be algorithms that are being actively worked on now by many good companies that we're all aware of that will deal with those uncertainties of, am I doing it right? Should I call the doctor? And many of these algorithms are going to be better than picking up the phone and talking to a doctor. Because doctors are great, I'm a doctor, but we're not perfect, and we're not always available in real time. Yeah. And most of the time when you need to get to a doctor, you can't. So I think a lot of this is going to go away over the next very few number of years as AI becomes more pervasive and invasive.
And the thing is, once you, in former times, when there was a diabetes that was hard to control, people in the hospital were hospitalized, and with the perfuser, the insulin level was adjusted constantly. Yeah. It took several days, but then how it's a rather simple calculation in the end, how the body reacts in steady state to certain levels of insulin. And a clever machine can even learn what happens if the food intake is higher, what happens if the person moves. So the machine can do more than a insulin perfuser in the hospital. This is also an interesting development.
Okay, we'll go here and then one last discussion afterwards.
Yes, thank you very much. I just think that your story fits into two overall general narratives, which I think are probably somehow very provocative. I mean, nowadays there is always this discussion about economization as some sort of a threat. This, at least in Europe, I would say. Your story also says that this is not something new or discussed in the 1990s or 1980s. I would say even the 1970s and 80s are something special, at least in Europe or Germany. This idea about that well-being and health is more or less for nothing, and you just pay into the health insurance. Since 18th century, even before, there is an economization of medicine. So this is an ongoing process, and your story just fits very well into this, because it's just, maybe there is a tiny period of 1970s and 80s where there was this illusion of, but that's whatever. The second thing is patient history. As Lawrence yesterday said, that about the 80% didn't go to the doctor first, or didn't go to the hospital. And there was a conference in a couple of weeks ago in Prague on healthcare before the welfare state, and Mick Warburg gave a talk on history from below, and the question about what do patients, patients going to the doctor only 20%. First, they ask their mother, they ask their friends, relatives, probably people working in the healthcare business, and so on and forth. And then they're going to the pharmacist or to the druggist and trying to do some self-care. And then they're going probably to the physician, and then a very tiny part go to the hospital. So exactly, this is the same story. So all this healthcare self-regulation, self-technologies is exactly within this greater narrative. It fits very well. But two questions. What are the consequences out of this new? Are there any? Is there something new out of this? What is the consequence if you constantly measure your blood pressure or your sugar? Does it have any consequences? For instance, if you have a heart attack, for instance, is there any threat of, okay, if you have not well behaved, you have drunk too much, you have eaten too much fat or whatever, so you have to pay half of the costs for, or you have to take a higher percentage. So is there any, what is the discussion about that? What are the consequences of the whole technologies of the self, especially before the context of risk? And as you said, the risk is back, so to say, on the individual. And the other question I was interested in, and this about the consequences. Your focus is on Germany, and a lot of the resources were from Germany. Would your story probably be different if you would have focused more on Anglo-American or American sources? Would there be some sort of a different shift, or that would be very interesting. So what happens from all this self-regulation, and what are the consequences, and would it be in different cultures?
The second question first. I think there would not be any difference. The role of the health insurance would be a little bit different, because the state is much more involved in Germany than in the US, and in Great Britain it's different again. But the overall story, I think, is the same. I looked at some US American sources. And the first question, well, I know it's not very modern to refer to Foucault, but I think the idea of biopower is one of the main consequences. At the moment, there are no real consequences in the German context if you do not measure your blood pressure correctly, or if you do not follow the guidelines of insulin uptake. No insurance will charge you for that. However, there is all these propaganda about consequences, and nobody wants to be to blame for his or her own stroke. People would rather love to see something like a stroke as fate than the consequence of their own actions. Now that there's a risk, and there's a risk for stroke, there is no fate anymore, and this leads to the classical idea of biopower, that without enforcement, people do what they are expected to do. Individualization leads to much more control, and in the end self-control. This is one of the consequences. Some health insurances discuss that if you behave correctly and measure your blood pressure constantly, you get reduced wages. Especially the private health insurances offer this concept. but also some of the public health insurances, especially in the East, are currently discussing offering these options.
Yeah. I have two comments. The first one is with regard, you painted a wonderful fresco. However, I wonder about cultural specific reasons. The cultural aspect was not present. For instance, why does the American Heart Association decide to lower the numbers? Number one. Number two, why the blood pressure numbers, although they appear to be globalized, there are cultural specific relationship with notable difference between different countries. This is my first question. And with the question of the follow this question, of his comments, possible consequences or problems, I would disagree. As a former consumer of United States healthcare service, as well as a smoker, that is crucial. Smoke, there is an enormous difference from the European cultural approach, Western European approach, and the USA cultural approach. And the last point is this, it is a question, do you think that your presentation would apply also with the quantification of the numbers regarding the cholesterol? The cholesterol. This is also both global but also specific and localized.
Yes, thank you for the question. Because maybe I was too quick in answering Axel's second question. I briefly, in one sentence, addressed one cultural aspect, that cardiovascular diseases are very prominent, much more prominent in Germany than in other European countries. That doesn't mean that they do not exist, but statistically one can see that the German medical community is obsessed with cardiovascular diseases. And this has different cultural reasons. Some of them lie in the biomedical culture, because much of this blood pressure measurement was invented in Germany and Austria in the 19th century. In the 1940s and 50s, most of the research done on that still came from Germany. But it has also to do with this, with the culture of adopting technologies, which started in the late 20th century, only countered by a neo-romantic movement in the 70s and 80s. But still, this is in Germany, I'm being very superficial now, but in Germany, the people who go to the mountains to experience culture wear the most modern technical clothes, synthetic design. They do not go in wool. So you can combine anti-technical ideas and adoption of technologies. So this adoption of technologies plays a role, but for the biomedical culture, I would still say that the biomedical culture, biomedicine seen as a culture of medicine that relies on reductionism as a concept, modeling as a further idea, and universalism. What's true in E. coli is true for man. A biomedical concept relying on these three steps has become the the biomedical culture of the Western world. And so the cultural differences only they change nuances, like the insurance systems change nuances. But if you look at culture from a viewpoint further away and compare Western biomedical culture, for example, to Japanese biomedical cultures, Chinese biomedical cultures, who also adopted the biomedical model, you see many differences in a great number of diseases, including blood pressure. It's treated completely different there. And for your final question, I think the basic storyline works with cholesterol and cholesterol. However, cholesterol has, I do not know why, disappeared from the discourse a little bit. And maybe this would be an hypothesis because it's not so easy to measure, easy to monitor, and not applicable in home use as blood pressure measurement is. And it affects your cultural life even more because you would have to change your eating habits and things like that. Yeah, sorry, it was too long.
Yeah,
but it's it took me away.
5 seconds.
Sorry.
The cholesterol is particularly interesting because, as you perfectly said, there are not machine technological devices. However, there is a multi-billion business on self-help. People buy
To look into that.
personal, how should I call it, remedies. Now that is a very large term. So I think the cholesterol, in another way, would fit.
I need to check it, yeah.
And especially because in Europe now there are at least 1 or 2 very large medical studies, a trial, with regard to one particular one. And the results are still...
Okay, so I think we'll stop
Thank you
there.
for the idea.
So fantastic discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Fangerau.
Thank you.